There existed a mathematics of endurance that operated beyond conventional understanding of strength, calculation that measured worth through capacity to absorb systematic diminishment without surrendering essential principles that defined identity, when everything else had been stripped away by circumstances that tested character beyond apparent breaking points. For Elith Ravencrest, this mathematics had become foundation of existence that had been shaped through years of learning to carry burdens that others couldn't perceive while maintaining dignity that transcended immediate circumstances to honor deeper truths about authentic power and its relationship to mercy rather than dominance. 26 years old and possessing presence that commanded attention through absence rather than assertion, she had learned to navigate hierarchies that valued demonstration over substance, sound over substance, intimidation over intelligence that served protective purposes, through methods that most individuals never recognized as necessary or valuable for maintaining stability within systems that prioritized immediate strength over sustainable wisdom about appropriate governance and community welfare. The Lycan kingdom existed as testament to conquest achieved through systematic application of force that honored domination over cooperation, territory expansion over internal development, fear over respect that might have served longer-term stability through methods that created genuine loyalty rather than submission, maintained through constant demonstration of superior power that required endl. SS validation to preserve effectiveness and appropriate recognition of royal authority. King Dracon Nightfall ruled according to principles that reduced complexity to simple calculations about strength and weakness, dominance and submission, victory and defeat, that failed to account for variables that operated beyond immediate physical capability to encompass endurance, wisdom, and strategic thinking that might prove more valuable than raw power for addressing challenges that require sustained effort rather than dramatic demonstration of superior force. His court reflected preferences that honored traditional alpha qualities while systematically dismissing characteristics that failed to conform to established expectations about appropriate strength and legitimate authority, creating an environment where worth was measured through capacity to intimidate rather than ability to serve constructive purposes that might enhance community welfare through methods that required different mathematical assessment of value and contribution. For years, Elith had served as convenient example of everything the kingdom supposedly transcended through superior strength and appropriate recognition of natural hierarchies that placed alphas above those whose genetic inheritance failed to provide obvious advantages in direct confrontation or competitive demonstration of dominance that shaped social relationships according to principles that each honored force over other considerations. Weakness incarnate had become the king's standard description when her presence provided opportunity for instruction about appropriate standards and necessary elimination of characteristics that might undermine kingdom strength through accommodation of limitations, rather than systematic encouragement of excellence that served territorial expansion and military effectiveness through conventional methods that honored traditional approaches to power. But what his assessment failed to recognize was that apparent weakness often concealed strength that operated according to different principles than direct confrontation, endurance that transcended immediate capability to encompass sustained performance under circumstances that challenged assumptions about appropriate methods for achieving strategic objectives that served protection rather than conquest through systematic application of force. Her lack of traditional omega scent had been interpreted as deficiency, rather than indication of uniqueness that might possess different significance than conventional biological markers suggested through normal assessment procedures, while her quiet presence was dismissed as evidence of inadequacy rather than strategic choice about appropriate timing for revelation of capability that operated beyond immediate demonstration. The systematic belittlement that characterized royal treatment of her existence had been designed to reinforce hierarchies while providing educational examples about appropriate recognition of worth, according to standards that honored dominance over other considerations. But such treatment had also created circumstances that tested character through sustained pressure that revealed authentic wrath, rather than performed strength. Years of absorbing casual cruelty without responding through violence or dramatic demonstration had carved patience into reflexes while developing understanding that authentic power required restraint rather than constant assertion, wisdom that recognized appropriate timing over immediate gratification, that might compromise longer-term effectiveness through premature revelation of capability that served different objectives than royal entertainment. But patience possessed limits that operated beyond individual endurance, to encompass recognition of circumstances that required different responses than strategic submission when systematic cruelty threatened others, whose protection demanded action that transcended personal comfort or safety considerations about appropriate behavior within hierarchies that prioritized royal preference over justice or mercy. The war that now approached territorial boundaries would test whether kingdom strength built through systematic intimidation could withstand challenges that required sustained courage rather than dramatic demonstrations of dominance, endurance rather than aggressive assertion, wisdom rather than brute force that had shaped military doctrine according to principles that honored conquest over protection of populations whose welfare depended on different mathematical assessment of strategic priorities. When conventional strength failed against enemies whose capabilities exceeded traditional defensive arrangements, when alpha dominance proved inadequate for addressing threats that operated beyond normal military assessment, when systematic intimidation created vulnerability rather than security through methods that had eliminated rather than developed resources that might serve protective purpose, as during crisis that challenged established approaches to territorial defense. In growing recognition that royal assumptions about appropriate strength might prove insufficient for current circumstances, kingdom foundations would be tested through confrontation that revealed whether authentic power resided in demonstration or endurance, intimidation or wisdom, conquest or protection that honored different principles about legitimate authority and its appropriate exercise, and circumstances demanded responses that transcended traditional approaches to leadership and community defense. The Omega, who had learned to absorb systematic diminishment without surrendering essential dignity, would discover whether years of restraint had preserved strength sufficient for moments when strategic submission became complicity in treatment that violated principles more fundamental than personal comfort or social acceptance within hierarchies that demanded recognition of authentic worth through demonstration rather than convenient assumption about appropriate sources of power. Tonight, mathematics would be recalculated according to evidence rather than assumption. Endurance would reveal its relationship to authentic strength, and apparent weakness would be tested against challenges that might prove that royal assessment had confused performance with reality, demonstration with capability, sound with substance that operated beyond immediate perception to encompass power, that honored protection over conquest through methods that served justice rather than systematic intimidation designed for maintenance of uncomfortable hierarchies. The great hall of the Lycan kingdom stretched before assembled court with architectural grandeur, designed to overwhelm individual significance through scale, that reinforced hierarchies while providing stage for demonstrations of royal authority that operated through systematic intimidation rather than earned respect. Marble surfaces that reflected voices with acoustic properties that amplified commands while diminishing responses that might challenge established order through inappropriate assertion of alternative perspectives. King Dracon Nightfall occupied throne carved from obsidian that captured light without reflecting warmth, his presence commanding attention through combination of physical dominance and systematic cultivation of fear that had shaped court dynamics according to principles that honored strength over wisdom, demonstration over substance, intimidation over leadership that might have served Kingdom Pew. Our poses through methods that created loyalty rather than submission maintained through constant threat of consequences. Around him, assembled nobles displayed deference that mixed genuine respect with calculated survival strategies, recognition that court attendance required careful navigation of royal preferences that could shift according to mood or political calculation rather than consistent principles about appropriate behavior and legitimate sources of authority that governed relationships between ruler and subjects who served territorial objectives through various forms of contribution. "War approaches our eastern borders," the king announced with tone that carried satisfaction rather than concern about developments that would provide opportunity for demonstration of kingdom strength through military effectiveness that honored traditional approaches to conflict resolution. Lord Commander Aldrich reports enemy forces massing in numbers that suggest coordinated assault rather than random raiding that has characterized previous incursions. The information sparked murmurs throughout assembled court as nobles processed implications of systematic military threat that might affect territorial security through methods that exceeded normal defensive arrangements, while their expressions revealed mixture of excitement about opportunity for glory and concern about personal consequences that might arise from extended military campaign requiring individual participation and resource allocation. Our response, King Lycan continued with momentum that indicated development toward demonstration of royal decision-making that would reinforce appropriate hierarchies while providing instruction about strength and weakness that characterized effective leadership, will demonstrate why alphas rule while others serve secondary functions that support military objectives through appropriate recognition of natural capabilities and legitimate authority. His attention shifted systematically across assembled court, with assessment that cataloged individual worth according to potential contribution to military objectives, evaluation that honored traditional qualifications, while dismissing characteristics that failed to provide obvious advantages for conventional warfare and territorial defense through established methods that prioritized physical dominance over alternative approaches to strategic thinking. "You," he said, with voice that carried across chamber to focus attention on figure who had been positioned at margins of assembly, where her presence could be acknowledged without suggesting importance equal to nobles, whose bloodlines provided appropriate credentials for royal recognition and meaningful participation in discussions about kingdom policies and strategic decisions. Elith Ravencrest stood with dignity that transcended immediate circumstances, while maintaining appropriate deference that acknowledged royal authority without surrendering personal worth that had been preserved through years of systematic diminishment, designed to reinforce hierarchies that placed her existence beyond meaningful consideration, except as convenient example of inadequacy that require decorrection. "Approach," King Lycan commanded with authority, that brooked no delay despite obvious intention to utilize her presence for demonstration purposes that would serve educational objectives about appropriate recognition of strength and weakness within court systems that governed social relationships, according to principles he preferred to maintain through systematic instruction. She moved forward with grace that suggested inner strength despite circumstances that had been designed to reduce confidence through constant exposure to royal disapproval and court dismissal that challenged self-worth, while testing character beyond normal parameters that might have proven adequate for individuals whose social positioning provided protection from such systematic pressure. "Here," the king announced with tone that transformed individual into object lesson for assembled audience, "stands perfect example of weakness that requires protection, rather than contributing meaningful assistance during circumstances that demand strength and capability, rather than accommodation of limitations that compromise military effectiveness." The casual dismissal of her worth sent ripples of uncomfortable laughter through assembled nobles who recognized royal entertainment, while understanding that participation in such demonstrations provided evidence of loyalty that might influence their own standing within court hierarchies that operated according to principles that honored royal preference over individual dignity or appropriate treatment of community members. "No scent of dominance," he continued with systematic cataloging of perceived deficiencies that would serve instructional purposes about appropriate standards and necessary elimination of characteristics that might undermine kingdom effectiveness. "No bloodline worth acknowledgement. No voice that carries authority sufficient for meaningful contribution to discussions about strategic objectives, our military planning." Around the chamber, court members watched with expressions that mixed entertainment with discomfort, as royal assessment reduced individual to collection of inadequacies that justified systematic exclusion from meaningful participation in community decisions while reinforcing comfortable assumptions about appropriate recognition and legitimate sources of authority that governed social relations. Furthermore, King Lycan said with momentum that carried demonstration toward territory where educational objectives would be achieved through detailed explanation of inadequacy that required correction through appropriate recognition of superior capability. Her presence during military campaign would represent liability rather than asset, weakness that might compromise operational effectiveness through inappropriate accommodation of limitations. The systematic demolition of her worth continued with professional precision that spoke of experience reducing individuals to inadequacy through detailed analysis that challenged competence while asserting royal superiority through methods designed to reinforce hierarchies that placed his authority beyond question or alternative assessment of value and contribution. Elith absorbed criticism with expression that revealed neither agreement nor resistance, stillness that suggested internal strength, despite circumstances that had been designed to provoke defensive response or emotional breakdown that would provide additional evidence of weakness requiring protection. rather than meaningful participation in kingdom activities that demanded different capabilities. When war comes, the king concluded with finality, that transformed assessment into decree about appropriate treatment during crisis that would test kingdom strength through conventional military methods. Such individuals will be evacuated with other non-combatants to locations where their limitations will not compromise strategic objectives or military effectiveness through inappropriate partaking. In activities that require authentic capability. The declaration carried weight of royal authority, while revealing strategic planning that prioritized conventional strength over alternative approaches that might serve defensive purposes through methods that honored different mathematical assessment of value and appropriate utilization of available resources during crisis that might require comprehensive response rather than limited recognition of acceptable contribution. But even as systematic belittlement continued with precision that demonstrated years of practice reducing her significance to convenient example of inadequacy, something in her posture suggested endurance that transcended immediate humiliation to encompass understanding about appropriate timing and strategic restraint that might serve different purposes than royal entertainment or courtly instruct. "Tyan, Your Majesty," she said, with voice that carried clearly despite apparent weakness that had been systematically catalogued through royal assessment, tone that honored appropriate deference while maintaining dignity that operated beyond immediate circumstances. "May I ask what constitutes authentic strength according to kingdom principles that govern such evaluation?" The question hung in chamber air that had been designed to amplify royal authority, while diminishing alternative perspectives that might challenge comfortable assumptions about appropriate power and its legitimate exercise through traditional methods that honored dominance over other considerations about effectiveness and strategic value. King Draken's expression revealed surprise that someone whose inadequacy had been thoroughly demonstrated would dare to request clarification about standards that should be obvious to anyone possessing basic understanding of appropriate hierarchies and legitimate sources of authority within kingdom systems that operated according to established principles about strength and weakness. "Strength," he replied, with tone that suggested question, revealed additional evidence of deficiency requiring instruction through detailed explanation of concepts that should be self-evident to individuals possessing adequate comprehension of natural law and appropriate recognition of superior capability, demonstrates itself through dominance that commands recognition rather than requiring explanation or justification. "Strength conquers rather than endures," he continued with momentum that indicated development toward comprehensive instruction about appropriate standards that governed evaluation within kingdom hierarchies. "Commands rather than serves, takes rather than protects, builds through destruction of opposition rather than accommodation of weakness that might compromise effectiveness." The systematic presentation of royal philosophy revealed approach to leadership that prioritized demonstration over substance, while reducing complexity to calculations that honored immediate power over sustained wisdom about appropriate governance and community welfare that might serve longer-term stability through different mathematical assessment of strategic objectives. Around the chamber, assembled nobles absorbed instruction with expressions that revealed recognition of concepts that shaped court dynamics, while understanding that participation in royal philosophy provided evidence of loyalty that might influence their standing within hierarchies that operated according to principles designed to maintain appropriate recognition of authority through systematic EEI enforcement. "Then strength," Elith observed with clarity, that cut through ceremonial atmosphere despite apparent insignificance that had been established through systematic royal assessment, requires opposition to prove its authenticity, rather than serving protective purposes that might enhance community welfare, without demanding recognition through demonstration or conquest that challenges limitations. The response carried implications that extended beyond simple clarification to encompass challenge of fundamental assumptions about appropriate power and its relationship to protection versus intimidation, service versus dominance, endurance versus assertion that might reveal different approaches to legitimate authority and strategic effectiveness during crisis. Royal expression darkened with recognition that question had evolved into territory where comfortable assumptions might be challenged through alternative perspective that honored different principles about strength and its appropriate exercise, while court atmosphere shifted from entertainment to tension as assembled nobles processed development that exceeded normal parameters for such demonstrate. "Ions. Guards," King Draken commanded with authority that transformed educational moment into disciplinary action, designed to reinforce appropriate boundaries and eliminate challenge that threatened comfortable hierarchies through inappropriate assertion of alternative assessment about power and its legitimate sources within kingdom systems that operated according to established principles. But before royal will could be implemented through systematic enforcement that would eliminate problematic perspective while reinforcing appropriate recognition of authority, urgent commotion at chamber entrance interrupted proceedings with development that would test whether royal philosophy possessed practical application beyond ceremonial demonstration. Your Majesty, Captain Kane burst through assembly with expression that mixed professional urgency with personal alarm about developments that had exceeded normal parameters for border security and territorial defense through methods that challenged established military doctrine and appropriate response strategies. Eastern defenses have been breached, he announced with clarity that transformed ceremonial proceeding into crisis management situation, requiring immediate royal attention and strategic decision-making that would determine kingdom response to threats that exceeded conventional assessment of enemy capability and appropriate defensive arrangements. Enemy forces advanced toward capital with numbers that suggest coordinated assault rather than random incursion, he continued with momentum that revealed scope of threat, while indicating that conventional military responses might prove inadequate for addressing challenge that operated beyond normal parameters for territorial security and established defensive protocols. The Great Hall fell into silence that pressed against surfaces designed to amplify royal authority, while crisis developed beyond ceremonial control, circumstances that would test whether systematic intimidation created strength sufficient for addressing threats that required sustained courage rather than demonstration, endurance rather than assertion, wisdom rather than dominance that had shaped kingdom philosophy through traditional approaches to power and its exercise. The transformation from ceremonial demonstration to crisis management occurred with brutal efficiency that revealed kingdom preparedness had been designed for gradual escalation rather than systematic assault that challenged fundamental assumptions about territorial security and appropriate defensive arrangements through enemy capability that exceeded normal assessment parameters and conventional military planning. King Draken's transition from courtly instruction to military command demonstrated authority that operated beyond ceremonial display, though his approach to strategic planning continued to reflect preferences that honored traditional hierarchy while dismissing alternative perspectives that might serve defensive purposes through methods that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate recognition and legitimate sources of strength during crisis. Mobilize all Alpha units immediately, he commanded with intensity that carried weight of ultimate authority, while revealing strategic thinking that prioritized conventional force over comprehensive assessment of available resources. Beta support formations will provide secondary assistance while Omega personnel are evacuated to secure locations where their limitations will not compromise operational effectiveness. The systematic organization of kingdom response reflected military doctrine that had been developed through successful territorial expansion rather than defensive necessity, approaches that honored demonstration over endurance, while eliminating variables that might serve protective purposes through methods that operated beyond traditional assessment of value and appropriate utilization of capabilities during circumstances that required comprehensive rather than selective response. Around the chamber, nobles and military personnel began coordination of mobilization that would test whether kingdom strength built through systematic intimidation possessed practical application when confronted by enemies whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters for conflict resolution and diplomatic arrangement that had previously served territorial security through established methods. But even as organizational efficiency demonstrated royal authority's capacity for strategic coordination, reports continued arriving with information that challenged comfortable assumptions about enemy capability and appropriate defensive measures that might prove adequate for addressing threats that operated beyond conventional military assessment and established protocols for territorial protection. Enemy numbers exceed initial estimates by significant margin, reported Commander Hayes with professional assessment that honored tactical reality while revealing developments that challenged established planning assumptions about appropriate resource allocation and strategic positioning that governed kingdom defensive arrangements through traditional methods. Furthermore, Captain Morrison interjected with growing urgency that reflected field reports from positions that maintained visual contact with advancing forces. Their formation suggests professional military training rather than random tribal coordination that indicates systematic planning and strategic objectives that exceed simple territorial acquisition or resource appropriation. The expanding scope of threat revealed through incoming intelligence suggested enemy capability that transcended normal parameters while requiring defensive response that might challenge kingdom philosophy about appropriate strength and its effective application through methods that honored traditional approaches to military conflict and territorial security arrangements. King Dracon processed information with expression that revealed growing recognition that circumstances exceeded ceremonial management, while requiring strategic decisions that would determine whether royal authority possessed practical application beyond demonstration of dominance through intimidation that had shaped court dynamics according to principles that prioritized appearance over substance. Deploy 1st through 3rd Alpha battalions to eastern approaches, he ordered with authority that attempted to address challenge through conventional force multiplication. Establish defensive lines according to standard protocols while maintaining communication that allows tactical adjustment based on enemy response to initial engagement and strategic positioning. The systematic application of military doctrine reflected training that had been developed through offensive rather than defensive necessity, while strategic assumptions continued to honor traditional assessment that prioritized alpha capability over comprehensive utilization of available resources that might serve protective purposes through alternative approaches to tactical planning and opera. Tactical effectiveness. As Royal Command initiated mobilization that would test kingdom strength against external threat, evacuation procedures began for populations whose presence had been deemed liability rather than potential asset during circumstances that required strategic thinking that operated beyond traditional limitations to encompass comprehensive response that honored all available capabilities. Omega evacuation to northwestern sanctuaries will begin immediately, announced Captain Sterling with professional efficiency that reflected administrative planning designed to eliminate complications while preserving resources according to established priorities about appropriate protection and legitimate concern that governed crisis management through conventional methods. Transportation will be provided according to standard protocols, continued Lieutenant Brooks with coordination that honored established procedures, while revealing assumptions about appropriate treatment during crisis that prioritized convenience over comprehensive assessment of individual capability that might serve defensive purposes through alternative approaches to strategic planning. Among those designated for evacuation, Elith found herself processing systematic exclusion with understanding that transcended personal disappointment to encompass recognition that royal philosophy created vulnerabilities through elimination of resources that might serve protective purposes, when conventional approaches proved inadequate for addressing threats that exceeded normal assessment parameters. Eaters. The northwestern routes, observed Duchess Helena, with growing concern that reflected strategic understanding beyond ceremonial positioning, require passage through territories where enemy advance units might establish interception points that could compromise evacuation security through tactical positioning that threatens civilian populations during withdrawal. Alternative routes exist, Captain Kane replied, with confidence that suggested military planning had accounted for such contingencies through established protocols, though travel time increases significantly while requiring resource allocation that might challenge defensive positioning if enemy advance exceeds current projections about timing and strategic coordination. The developing complexity revealed planning limitations that had emerged from assumptions about gradual escalation rather than systematic assault, while evacuation procedures that had been designed for convenience might prove inadequate when confronted by enemy capability that operated beyond normal parameters for territorial threat and appropriate response strategies. But even as organizational efficiency demonstrated kingdom capacity for crisis coordination, systematic exclusion of individuals whose capabilities challenged traditional assessment continued according to royal philosophy that prioritized demonstration over substance, while eliminating resources that might serve defensive purposes through methods that honored different mathematical approaches to SIs. Strategic planning. Transportation departs at dawn, announced evacuation coordinator with authority that reflected administrative decision-making designed to eliminate complications through systematic removal of populations whose presence had been deemed problematic for military operations. Individuals will be processed according to standard protocols, while maintaining security that preserves operational effectiveness. Around her, Omega personnel prepared for departure, that would remove them from circumstances where their presence might challenge royal philosophy about appropriate strength, while their compliance reflected understanding that resistance to evacuation orders would create additional complications without serving constructive purposes that might enhance defensive capability or community protection. Yet as preparations continued with efficiency that demonstrated kingdom administrative capacity, reports from forward positions revealed developments that challenged comfortable assumptions about enemy timeline and strategic positioning that might affect evacuation routes while requiring tactical adjustments that honored changing circumstances rather than established procedures. Enemy scouts reported approaching Northwestern Passage, Captain Morrison announced with urgency, that transformed evacuation planning from routine administration to tactical necessity requiring immediate adjustment. Advance units moving faster than projections indicated while demonstrating coordination that suggests professional reconnaissance and strategic intelligence gathering. The revelation that enemy forces operated according to comprehensive planning rather than opportunistic advance created complications for evacuation procedures that had been designed according to assumptions about timing and enemy capability that might prove inadequate when confronted by systematic military coordination that exceeded normal parameters for territorial threat assessment. King Draken found himself confronting circumstances that challenged royal authority through practical limitations rather than ceremonial opposition, recognition that enemy capability required strategic response that might exceed traditional approaches to military command and territorial defense through methods that honored comprehensive rather than selective utilization of available resources. Delay evacuation until alternative routes can be secured, he commanded with authority, that attempted to address complications through administrative adjustment, while his expression revealed growing recognition that circumstances operated beyond ceremonial control to require tactical flexibility that might challenge established assumptions about appropriate strength and its effective application. But delay carried implications that extended beyond administrative convenience to encompass strategic vulnerability, as enemy advance created compression of available options while requiring defensive response that might challenge kingdom philosophy about appropriate hierarchy and legitimate recognition of capability that served protective purposes through alternative approaches to crisis management. In growing recognition that traditional approaches might prove inadequate for addressing systematic threat, royal authority faced confrontation between established philosophy and practical necessity that would determine whether kingdom strength possessed substance sufficient for circumstances that required endurance rather than demonstration, wisdom rather than intimidation, comprehensive response, rather than selective recognition of acceptable capability. As evening approached with darkness that would complicate evacuation while providing cover for enemy movement, assembled populations found themselves caught between evacuation procedures that had been compromised by enemy advance and defensive arrangements that excluded their participation according to royal philosophy that prioritized traditional strength over comprehensive assessment of available ressources. Among those awaiting transportation that might no longer provide security, Elith processed developing circumstances with understanding that transcended personal concern to encompass recognition that systematic exclusion created vulnerabilities that might prove costly when conventional approaches encountered challenges that required different mathematical assessment of strategic necessity and appropriate utilization of capability that operated beyond traditional limitations. The kingdom that had been built through systematic intimidation would soon discover whether such foundations possessed strength sufficient for circumstances that required authentic power rather than demonstrated dominance, endurance rather than assertion, protection rather than conquest, that honored different principles about legitimate authority and its appropriate exercise when conventional strength encountered limitations that challenged comfortable assumptions about power and its practical application during crisis that exceeded normal parameters. In growing darkness that concealed movement while revealing intent, forces would converge according to mathematics that honored capability over ceremony, necessity over preference, authentic strength over comfortable assumption that had shaped kingdom philosophy through methods that might prove inadequate when tested against enemies whose coordination exceeded royal assessment while requiring defensive response that challenged traditional approaches to territorial protection and strategic planning. The collapse of kingdom defenses occurred with systematic precision that revealed enemy capability far exceeded royal assessment, professional coordination that dismantled established defensive positions through tactical superiority rather than simple numerical advantage, while reports flowing toward capital carried information that challenged every assumption about appropriate military strength, and conventional approaches to territorial protection through traditional methods. By midnight, 3 Alpha battalions had been eliminated or scattered according to intelligence that reached Royal Command through surviving communication networks, their positions overrun through enemy tactics that demonstrated understanding of Kingdom military doctrine, while exploiting weaknesses that had been created through exclusive reliance on traditional hierarchy rather than comprehensive utilization of available defensive resources. King Lycan received updates with expression that cycled through disbelief, rage, and growing comprehension that royal philosophy about appropriate strength had created vulnerabilities through systematic elimination of capabilities that might have served defensive purposes when conventional approaches proved inadequate for addressing threats that operated beyond normal parameters for territorial security and established military planning. 4th Battalion reports enemy breakthrough at Eastern Approach, Captain Kane announced with professional control that barely concealed personal horror at developments that had exceeded worst-case scenarios, while revealing scope of defeat that challenged fundamental assumptions about Kingdom strength and appropriate defensive arrangements through traditional methods. 5th and 6th Battalions have lost communication entirely, continued Commander Hayes with momentum that indicated systematic failure rather than isolated tactical setbacks, while enemy advance units have been confirmed approaching capital perimeter with coordination that suggests comprehensive intelligence about our defensive positioning and strategic vulnerabilities. The expanding scope of military disaster revealed through incoming reports suggested enemy planning that had accounted for Kingdom philosophy while exploiting assumptions about appropriate strength that had shaped defensive doctrine according to principles that honored demonstration over substance, hierarchy over capability, traditional assessment over comprehensive evaluation of available resources. Around Royal Command Center that had been established for crisis coordination, military personnel processed information that challenged their understanding of territorial security while revealing limitations in strategic thinking that had been shaped by successful offensive operations rather than defensive necessity that required different mathematical approaches to tactical planning and resource utilization. Evacuation routes have been compromised, reported evacuation coordinator, with tone that mixed professional assessment with personal recognition of failure that had endangered civilian populations whose protection represented primary responsibility during crisis that exceeded military capability. Enemy units have established interception points at Northwestern Passage while demonstrating siege of alternative routes. The systematic disruption of civilian protection procedures revealed enemy intelligence that extended beyond military assessment to encompass comprehensive understanding of Kingdom administrative arrangements and evacuation protocols that had been designed according to assumptions about timing and enemy capability that proved inadequate when confronted by superior planning and tactical coordinate. King Lycan found himself confronting consequences of royal philosophy that had prioritized comfortable hierarchy over practical necessity, systematic intimidation over authentic strength, demonstration over substance that might have served defensive purposes when conventional approaches encountered limitations that challenged established assumptions about appropriate power and its effective application during crisis. Options? He demanded with authority that attempted to maintain command effectiveness, despite circumstances that had revealed fundamental inadequacy in strategic planning and defensive preparation, that reflected years of prioritizing appearance over capability through methods that honored traditional hierarchy, rather than comprehensive assessment of territorial protection requirements. Remaining Alpha units can attempt consolidated defense of capital approaches, Commander Hayes replied, with professional assessment that balanced tactical reality against royal expectations about appropriate military response. Though enemy coordination suggests systematic planning that may have accounted for such concentration through alternative tactical approaches that exceed our current defensive capability. Negotiation might provide alternative resolution, suggested Captain Morrison with diplomatic consideration that honored practical necessity, while acknowledging that military solution might prove inadequate when conventional strength encountered superior capability through enemy coordination that had demonstrated understanding of Kingdom vulnerabilities and appropriate exploitation methods. The proposals reflected growing recognition that circumstances required strategic flexibility that might challenge royal authority through practical limitations rather than ceremonial opposition, while enemy capability had created compression of available options that demanded decisions about appropriate response to threats that exceeded traditional assessment parameters and established defensive protocols. But before royal decision could address developing crisis through available options, urgent commotion at command center entrance interrupted proceedings with development that would transform strategic assessment from theoretical planning to immediate tactical necessity, requiring comprehensive response rather than selective recognition of acceptable capability. "Enemy forces approaching Capitol gates," announced Messenger with urgency that reflected direct observation rather than intelligence reports. "Advance units establishing siege positions, while main force coordinates systematic assault that suggests immediate rather than gradual escalation of threat to royal authority and civilian populations." The revelation that enemy advance had compressed timeline beyond conventional planning parameters created circumstances that required immediate response through whatever capabilities remained available, while traditional approaches that had governed defensive strategy proved inadequate for addressing systematic coordination that operated beyond normal assessment of territorial threat and appropriate light military response. Around command center that had been designed for strategic coordination rather than immediate tactical necessity, military personnel processed development that revealed fundamental inadequacy in defensive preparation while requiring decisions that might challenge kingdom philosophy about appropriate recognition of capability and legitimate utilization of available resources during crisis that exceeded conventional parameters. "All available personnel to defensive positions," King Draken commanded with authority that attempted to address immediate threat through comprehensive mobilization, while his expression revealed recognition that circumstances had moved beyond ceremonial control to require practical response that might challenge comfortable assumptions about power and its appropriate exercise through traditional methods. But systematic exclusion that had characterized kingdom philosophy created limitations in available personnel, while evacuation procedures had removed individuals whose capabilities might have served defensive purposes through alternative approaches to tactical planning that honored comprehensive rather than selective assessment of strategic resources and community protection requirements. In growing recognition that royal authority faced consequences of systematic elimination of resources that might serve protective purposes, defensive preparation proceeded according to whatever capabilities remained, after exclusionary policies had removed individuals whose contribution might have enhanced community protection, through methods that operated beyond traditional assessment of appropriate strength and legitimate recognition. Yet among those who had been designated for evacuation but remained due to compromised transportation arrangements, awareness developed that circumstances required different response than administrative compliance. When conventional authority proved inadequate for addressing threats that endangered community welfare through enemy coordination that exceeded defensive capability and appropriate protection of civilian populations, Elith found herself processing systematic exclusion with understanding that transcended personal circumstances to encompass recognition that authentic strength might require individual action when collective response proved inadequate for addressing challenges that threatened community survival through methods that honored protection over personal safety or social acceptance within hierarchies and had failed to provide adequate defensive capability. As darkness deepened around capital that faced systematic assault by forces whose coordination exceeded kingdom defensive capability, individuals whose presence had been deemed liability rather than asset during crisis discovered that circumstances might require response that operated beyond traditional authority, when conventional strength proved inadequate for protecting communities that depend on comprehensive rather than selective recognition of available capabilities. The mathematics of endurance that had shaped her existence through years of systematic diminishment would soon be tested against challenges that might prove royal assessment had confused performance with reality, demonstration with capability, apparent weakness with strategic restraint, that preserved authentic strength for circumstances that required protection rather than conquest through method, as that honored different principles about power and its appropriate exercise. In growing awareness that kingdom philosophy had created vulnerabilities through systematic exclusion, while enemy capability threatened civilian populations, whose protection represented moral necessity, regardless of official recognition or appropriate authority, individual choice would be tested against collective failure to provide adequate response through traditional approaches that had prioritized hierarchy over comprehensive assessment of defensive requirements. The Omega, who had absorbed systematic belittlement without surrendering essential dignity, would discover whether years of restraint had preserved strength sufficient for circumstances that required action beyond ceremonial submission, when authentic power demanded demonstration through protection rather than conquest, endurance rather than intimidation, service rather than dominance that might sear. Community welfare through methods that transcended traditional assessment of capability and appropriate recognition. Behind royal command that struggled with consequences of systematic inadequacy, forces gathered according to mathematics that would honor authentic rather than performed strength, substance over appearance, protection over demonstration through methods that might reveal whether apparent weakness concealed power that operated beyond traditional assessment, to serve purposes greater than individual comfort or social acceptance within hierarchies that had failed to provide adequate community protection through conventional approaches. The reckoning that had been building through years of systematic exclusion was approaching culmination that would test whether authentic strength resided in demonstration or endurance, conquest or protection, intimidation or wisdom that honored comprehensive rather than selective assessment of capability and appropriate utilization of available resources when circumstances demanded response that transcended traditional authority to serve community survival through individual choice that operated beyond official recognition or ceremonial approval. 1 year later, the Royal Council Chamber had been transformed from space designed for ceremonial intimidation into environment that honored comprehensive assessment of capability, while maintaining appropriate dignity for discussions that affected kingdom-wide welfare through policies that balanced traditional authority with recognition of diverse sources of strength and wisdom that served communion. Type protection, rather than systematic domination through fear or hierarchical manipulation. Queen Elith Ravencrest stood before assembled leadership that reflected fundamental changes in governance philosophy, her presence representing transformation from systematic exclusion to central authority that honored endurance over demonstration, while establishing precedent about authentic power and its appropriate exercise through service, rather than conquest or intimidation, that had previously. I characterized royal approach to territorial management and community welfare. Her elevation from belittled Omega to supreme authority had required systematic reconstruction of kingdom foundations, while preserving essential structures that served protective purposes. Process that honored individual worth while maintaining institutional effectiveness through methods that balance comprehensive assessment with practical necessity for territorial security and community stability. The Northern Territories have completed integration of defensive reforms, she reported with satisfaction, that reflected widespread implementation of policies that had emerged from direct confrontation between traditional assumptions and practical necessity. Approaches that honored capability over hierarchy while establishing recognition protocols that prevented systematic exclusion of resources that might serve protective purposes. Military doctrine now emphasizes comprehensive utilization of available personnel rather than exclusive reliance on traditional hierarchy, she continued, with analysis that processed transformation through strategic understanding that balanced effectiveness with ethical principles about appropriate treatment of individuals whose capabilities served community protection through diverse, rather than in-uniform approaches to tactical planning. The systematic revision of military philosophy had established foundations for territorial defense that honored endurance alongside demonstration, while recognizing that authentic strength emerged through sustained service rather than immediate intimidation or conquest that might compromise longer-term stability through methods that created resentment rather than genuine loyalty among populations, whose welfare depended on comprehensive protection. Around the chamber, assembled advisors who represented various capabilities and perspectives, rather than exclusively traditional bloodlines, participated in discussions that honored diverse assessment of strategic challenges, while maintaining appropriate coordination that served kingdom-wide objectives through collective wisdom, rather than individual dominance or systematic intimidation designed to suppress alternative approaches. The integration process has demonstrated remarkable success, observed Chancellor Marcus Whitehall, with professional assessment that honored evidence over assumption, while acknowledging systematic changes that had challenged comfortable hierarchies through recognition of capability that operated beyond traditional limitation, particularly regarding defensive effectiveness, that emerges through CI, comprehensive rather than selective recognition of available resources. Territorial security has improved significantly, confirmed General Sarah Ironwood, with military analysis that honored practical results over theoretical preference, while community cohesion has strengthened through recognition policies that honor individual contribution rather than systematic exclusion based on inherited characteristics or traditional assessment of appropriate capability. The diplomatic success that had emerged from honest acknowledgement of diverse strength suggested that authentic authority operated through recognition rather than intimidation, while serving protective purposes that enhanced rather than diminished community welfare, through methods that honored comprehensive assessment over comfortable assumption about power and its legitimate sources. Former King Draken, whose position had been restructured rather than eliminated following systematic failure of exclusive philosophy, approached with expression that mixed recognition of past error with developing understanding of authentic leadership that served protection rather than personal authority through demonstration or systematic intimidation designed to maintain uncomfortable hierarchy. Your Majesty, he said with deference that honored current authority, while acknowledging transformation that had preserved kingdom survival through individual action when collective response proved inadequate. The reconstruction has exceeded every projection about recovery timeline and institutional effectiveness following systematic revision of fundamental principles. Individual choice to stand against impossible odds. He continued with momentum that revealed personal recognition of character that had been systematically dismissed through royal assessment that confused appearance with reality, demonstrated authentic strength that preserved community survival when traditional approaches proved inadequate for addressing comprehensive threat. Their conversation reflected understanding that had been developing throughout months when individual transformation had inspired institutional changes that honored recognition over exclusion while maintaining appropriate standards for territorial security that served community protection through comprehensive rather than selective assessment of available capabilities and strategic resources. The memorial protocols have been completed as well, Queen Elith observed with satisfaction, that spoke of systematic changes that honored sacrifice through permanent acknowledgement rather than convenient forgetting, policies that prevented future exclusion of contribution while establishing recognition that served educational purposes about authentic strength and its appropriate recognition through community appreciation. Every individual who fell during the siege receives acknowledgement by name and contribution. She continued with analysis that honored comprehensive rather than selective commemoration, while their families receive recognition that reflects actual service rather than administrative convenience about appropriate treatment of community members whose sacrifice preserved territorial survival through individual choice. The memorial approach had established precedent that prevented systematic erasure while providing communities with accurate understanding of events rather than comfortable revision that served political convenience over historical accuracy about dependency and sacrifice that had shaped survival through individual courage that operated beyond official recognition or ceremonial approval. Throughout territories where royal authority extended beyond ceremonial recognition to encompass practical protection of populations whose welfare depended on comprehensive rather than exclusive approaches to governance, communities had learned about transformation that honored endurance alongside demonstration, while recognizing that authentic power served protection rather than conquest through systematic application of wisdom. The educational reforms continue to demonstrate positive results, she noted with professional satisfaction, that reflected broader implications of policies that had emerged from individual recognition rather than continued systematic exclusion, particularly regarding curricula that teach accurate assessment of capability rather than traditional assumption about appropriate strength and legitimate to sources of authority. Young people throughout the kingdom are learning about authentic leadership that serves protection rather than personal advancement through intimidation, she added with momentum that carried assessment toward recognition of generational change that would preserve transformation through educational foundation, rather than administrative convenience that might revert to comfortable hierarchies. An immediate pressure diminished. The educational transformation had established sustainable foundation for continued recognition of diverse capability, while preventing systematic return to exclusive philosophy that had created vulnerabilities through elimination of resources that served protective purposes when traditional approaches proved inadequate for addressing comprehensive challenges. In growing light that illuminated throne room, where systematic transformation had preserved kingdom survival through individual choice that operated beyond official authority, Queen Elaith found herself reflecting on journey that had led from systematic belittlement through direct confrontation with impossible odds to recognition that honored authentic strength over comfortable assumption about Poe. There. The night when she had stood alone against systematic assault that had overwhelmed conventional defenses would be remembered as moment when endurance revealed its relationship to authentic power, when apparent weakness demonstrated its connection to strategic restraint, when individual choice transcended collective failure to serve community protection through sacrifice that honored others over personal safety. But perhaps most importantly, her elevation had proven that strength resided in service rather than dominance, protection rather than conquest, recognition rather than intimidation, that might serve immediate convenience while creating longer-term vulnerability through systematic exclusion of capabilities that operated beyond traditional assessment to encompass comprehensive approaches to community welfare and territorial security. The mathematics of endurance had been recalculated according to evidence rather than assumption, revealing that authentic power honored protection over demonstration, while serving community survival through methods that balanced individual worth with collective necessity for security that protected rather than threatened populations whose welfare represented primary responsibility of legitimate authority. Around them, kingdom that had been preserved through individual action, when collective response proved inadequate, continued transformation that honored comprehensive assessment over exclusive hierarchy while maintaining appropriate coordination that served territorial protection through recognition of diverse capabilities rather than systematic elimination of resources that might serve defensive purposes through alternative approaches. In royal archives, where their reforms would be preserved for future study, scholars would document methods that had balanced recognition with practical necessity, while learning that authentic strength required endurance alongside demonstration, service rather than dominance, protection rather than conquest, that honored different mathematical assessment of power and its appropriate exercise through comprehensive rather than selective acknowledgement of capability. But in private moments when duty allowed reflection on transformation that had emerged through direct confrontation between assumption and reality, they would remember throne room where systematic belittlement had challenged character that refused to surrender essential dignity, despite circumstances that tested endurance beyond apparent limitations through sustained pressure that revealed I see rather than performed strength. The Omega, who had learned to absorb diminishment without surrendering principles, had discovered that apparent weakness could conceal power that operated according to different mathematics than demonstration or intimidation, endurance that served protection through strategic restraint, until circumstances demanded action that transcended traditional authority to honor community survival over safety or social acceptance. Their story had begun with systematic exclusion, disguised as appropriate hierarchy, continued through individual choice that challenged collective inadequacy, and culminated in transformation that honored authentic strength, while establishing precedent about power and its relationship to service, rather than conquest, through methods that preserved dignity while protecting communities that depended on comprehensive rather than exclusive assessment of available capabilities. The throne room where royal authority had once operated through systematic intimidation now served as space where recognition honored diverse contribution while maintaining appropriate coordination for territorial security, demonstration that authentic power required wisdom alongside strength, service rather than dominance, protection rather than conquest, that honored different principles about legitimate authority and its appropriate exercise through comprehensive assessment of strategic necessity. Some transformations required crisis to reveal their completion, and theirs had been achieved through individual choice that operated beyond official recognition, when circumstances demanded response that transcended traditional authority to serve protection, rather than personal advancement through methods that honored community survival over comfortable hierarchies that had proven inadequate for addressing comprehensive challenges to territorial security and population welfare.